Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nigel St. James, clairvoyant. And now we're going to have a look at astrology in a way that you have probably never seen it before. Now, predictive astrology is one thing, but did you know that astrology, the main interest of astrologers back in Babylon, Chaldea, ancient Egypt and Greece was not so much with prediction. It was really what could astrology tell us about the evolution of the universe, about the evolution of humans within that universe, or rather as part of that universe, because you're not outside it looking into it. You are in fact a part of the universe. You are the universe itself. Now, predictive astrology can basically be summed up by me in these very simple things, three things. Number one, planets do something. Two, through the prescriptive lens of the signs. And three, where do they do it? It's in the houses. But we today are going to talk about something which takes a veil away from that. In fact, takes a couple of veils away from it. The first veil that we're taking away is that of planets. The second veil that we're taking away is that of houses. Now, by the way, this is time-stamped, and so you can jump around however you would like, but obviously the story will make more sense to you if you start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. I'll deal with each of these briefly. It's a brief overview of it. It's a very deep subject, but I know that your time is limited. Now, we have here the standard astrological wheel, don't we? And starting in the east. And the reason why it is the east, incidentally, is that in the northern hemisphere, where astrology kicked off, people looked to see where the sun was at its highest and brightest, and so they had to face south. And on the left-hand side was east. Of course, it's the opposite in the southern hemisphere. But that's why the east is here, and Aries is the beginning. Now, there are here the particular signs that I've noted, the glyphs of them, and it is the glyphs which you and I are going to have a particular look at, because they're going to tell us what's actually going on with the soul within the evolution of the soul coming into matter and then going back into unity. Now, this is spiritual, it's not religious. In fact, I am clearly someone who has a great interest in spiritual matters. When I was born, I received a couple of spiritual gifts, that of clairvoyance and the other one being of healing. Now, I do clairvoyant readings for people from all over the world, from FaceTime and Skype, and you can check that out in the description. That's charged for, I have to. Healings, however, are free, and the healing comes through me and not from me. And the description about that is in the description as well. And if you are minded to or feel compelled to, just reach out to me for healing. I'm very glad to do it because it is my sole obligation to do it. Anyway, turning aside now from that, let's look to see here. Now, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 houses that are there, but in this case, they're not houses. It's just somewhere for me to put the sign. In fact, what we have here is, it's not a house as such, it is a divine impulse that is happening. First is Aries, which is the beginner of creation. Then there is Taurus, which is the sign of procreation. Then we have the third impulse being Gemini, where there is polarity in the heavens. Then we come to Cancer, where we have the greatest heights and the lowest depths. By the time the soul gets to the fifth impulse of Leo, there is individualization, the feeling that I am something that is different to something else. We get to Virgo, and Virgo is what I would call the mother of creation. A lot of sorrow is sometimes attached to Virgo. In fact, she has a cross that's attached to her end there, as we'll look at in just a moment or two. We then come to Libra. Libra represents the cosmic dance, that balance between materiality and spiritual engagement. Scorpio is the seat of the fire within the serpent. Sagittarius, the beloved of the gods. Capricorn, well, the complicated Capricorn, as we shall see. Aquarius, the father of the new age. And then the final impulse, the 12th divine impulse, is that which is very auspicious. It's the auspicious great 12th impulse. Now what we have also is going from Aries through to really certainly as far down as Virgo, but even as far as Libra, in my estimation, we have what they call, or what I call, the involution of the soul. And by involution, I know it's a big word, but it basically just means something is changing away from its purest original form. It's an entanglement. The word involved, for example, means that you might be entangled with something. And that is the soul from Aries and through each impulse going down to Virgo. And I'd say also as far as Libra, it is the involution, the gradual entanglement of the soul with matter itself. Then changes around from Scorpio through each divine impulse until we hit Pisces, where there is an evolution. And an evolution is a change which takes you from one particular place to another place, where there is an advancement, where there is a moving forward. And in a nutshell, what this is, it's the descent of the soul into matter and its ascent back into the divine. Now, it's not a religious program, as I say, so I might use words like divine or soul or spirit. You can make of them whatever you want. It's up to you. But it's unavoidable in a subject such as this. Now, there's a couple of things which are also interesting, I think, and there's a couple of signs which we often see in astrological glyphs. I'll just do this and show it to you. This, as you can see here, is a cross. One has the horizontal line at the top and the other one going somewhere through the middle. What does this represent? Well, the vertical line in both of these images represents consciousness, pure consciousness. You might call it whatever you want to call it. It's pure consciousness. It has a masculine aspect to it. The horizontal line in both cases refers to matter, to material reality. And it has a feminine aspect to it. Now, characterizing either as being male or female is not making any judgment call on either gender. Rather, particularly in the case of the horizontal material line, it is the female principle, which gives birth to things, which creates things, which produces reality and life. So you can see here the combination of spirit and matter, and that is what the universe and the world is. There's another sign which we often see, and it is that of an arrow of some description. Well, an arrow is something which is aimed at something. There is some force behind it. There's a force which is used to draw the bow and to aim at something in order to hit the objective. In the occult case of the esoteric astrology that I'm referring to now, that goal is that of the divine. Now there's another very interesting, and I'll just get rid of these for a second. Just bear with me for a second, and I'll ask you a question, and you might tell me. Okay, over here, do you see a circle? You don't, do you? Let's draw a circle. Now bear with me, I'm not an artist. I am literally the poor man's Jackson Pollock. But a circle, roughly, is a circumference, that is something that bounds, usually, well, always, a point. That is, it has a relation to the point. It is something which is at an even distance from a central point. Now, if there is no point, there is no circle. So let's take this circle away. I'll get to the punchline in just a second. Bear with me. Now, do you see a point there? You don't. Well, did you know that a point actually does not exist? It is a creature of the human mind. The point has no direction, no up, down, backwards, forwards, no place. Now, someone might say, oh, well, a point can be found by intersecting two lines, but a line has to start from a point, and there isn't one. You need to have a point in order to have a circle. So this might seem like 101, but here is a point. Now, from a point, you can then establish a circle around it. Again, apologies for my lack of artistic ability. Now, what's interesting about this is that this point here, as far as we are concerned, actually represents the fountainhead of divine energy and expansion coming into the material universe. Without that point, and this comprises the circle and the area within it, comprises the universe and everything material that's within it. But without a point, that goes away. And so that we can say that that point, that fountainhead of divine energy, sustains all of matter, all of time, all of space, and everything included in it, to the past and in the future. What's also important, I think, is this to understand, is that when we do have this point that's here and a circle around it, again, well, I've made that more like an oval. Just bear with me for a second. I'm doing this by hand because I think it's kind of more personal. Don't you agree? Here's my attempt at a circle again. One thing that we can say about a circle is, why don't I just move this point a bit further across? One thing that we can say about a circle is formed when everything here in this circumference is at the same distance from that point. What's also the case is that you are able to segment places around the outside of the circle. So there's symmetry, there's balance in this symbol of the circle. And it's a symmetry and a balance which I would suggest was intended by the divine so that matter could be understood by the elements of matter within it, such as us. And therefore, we can have science, which talks about atoms and trains and spaceships and all those sorts of things. The other interesting thing here to note is that And I will say this now only because the mathematically inclined, and I'm not going to go right into the math of it, but the other thing about a circle is this. And again, apologies for the thing. If they say we want to find what the circumference of this circle is, we use I'll just briefly write it. I'm not going to spend any time on this. But we use a Greek letter, and it is pi, a letter of the Greek alphabet. And it is roughly 3.14, and then the decimal numbers keep going on to infinity. In fact, as of early 2024, the decimal places have gone out to more than 100 trillion, and still there has been no exact prescription as to what this thing is. So when we are saying that we are multiplying a number by the number of the diameter as we see it, it's only ever an approximation. Because, first of all, this number is infinite. It's a number which can't be used, except in a very approximate way, to find out the circumference. Because the circle itself doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a circle in nature. There is things look like circles, but they don't exist. They exist in the other realm. They exist in the mind of God. Or, if you want to try and find out what all of this area in here is, you take, they say, pi, again using that number, times the square of the radius. But again, it's not going to give you an answer. It's only give you an approximation. So what looks to be real, in fact, is only an illusion that actually exists in the mind of God and that we buy into. Anyway, enough of that now. Why don't we start with the first impulse, and that is Aries. Well, here we come to the first impulse of Aries, and here is the sign for Aries, and it's deceptively simple, isn't it? There's a vertical line. The vertical line stands for pure consciousness, and this simplicity here can ensure that we really miss what is going on. Because this actually stands for the pre-universe state of existence. This stands for pure consciousness. Now, as I say, you can assign whatever definition you want to the thing that I am calling pure consciousness. But what this is here is this first sign. This is the first creative impulse that comes through the sign of Aries. It is the consciousness aspect of the manifestation process. It is, in a sense, the divine unfoldment. And this divine unfoldment doesn't need anything from outside to make it happen, and it doesn't need anything to make it multiply. Now, what happens then is that this pure consciousness, which is unified, decides to become two. And you can see them in these two leaves, as I'll call them, that spring from the top of the line there. Now, this two becomes male and female. They're principles which come from within pure consciousness, from within the divine. It is here we have the initial impulse of the divine itself to begin the creative process. Now, this marks the beginning of the universe and of in time, the gradual ascent of humanity. Now, Aries is in the process of moving from this unified, formless, formless and non-material spirit, moving into matter. That is to say, it's moving away from the purely subjective, that is, if something is subjective to you, you might say, well, there is something that is there. What is my perception of it? What is my feeling about it? How do I feel about it? What is it like for me to be me in the context of these material things? So we are moving from the experience of pure subjective awareness to the observation of things that are different to us and things that exist irrespective of what we tend to think about it. Now, these two leaves, I think, also show the profound energy, the desire, the lust in Aries to grow, to move forward. And this comes from pure consciousness, from the spirit. There's huge energy in this impulse, and it won't surprise you to find huge energy within Aries individuals themselves. The leaves show the urge to grow. Now, this first creative impulse, this first creative act, coming from out of spirit, contains within it the embryo, the golden egg, if you like, of everything which is yet to emanate or to come about. Now, this urge for creation can only occur where there is differentiation, where these two leaves, where male and female, where there is a differentiation between things, where there is this and where there is that. That's material reality. So there is a real, what I would call ambivalence, sometimes to be found in this impulse, sometimes to be found in Aries. By ambivalence, I mean I haven't quite made my mind up on it, or I could go with it, I may go with it, I may not go with it. You see that with Aries, don't you? And so what there is to say here is that there's nothing yet formed. It's an energy which is available, going in all directions. It might be withdrawn, it might be pushed ahead. But this is, in fact, the first of things that are to come. Now, these spreading leaves, incidentally, don't mean that there is no spirituality within Aries. This first arc is talking about the desire to come into matter, and this arc here, which goes in this direction, is talking about a desire for reunion. So really what it is that Aries contains within it the seed of the whole drama of the descent of the soul and its entanglement in matter and its effort to push free of the material existence and to reunite. Now, in some respects, what's also the case is that there's a couple of other things, rather than just leave it at leaves. Some people have, and particularly in the East, or the subcontinent, in the Indian traditions, they've sometimes said, look, this is a serpent's tongue, perhaps, you know. And serpents can sometimes be venomous, and venom can either be used to poison, or it can be used to cure things. The Aries person, this impulse can enable things to kill, to come back, to restore. This impulse is contained within this impulse here. But the ram is also the great and acknowledged symbol of Aries in the Western tradition. And the ram has always been used in esoteric circles throughout the West and throughout the East as well. And the ram, the male sheep, it signifies purity. It's coming in spring in the Northern Hemisphere, so it's fertile, it's playful, it's joyful, it wants to jump and to move and to explore and to see things. That's this impulse of Aries. The leaves, though, they show the sprouting of divinity in humanity, and then humanity will go through different phases, as we have seen here. But interestingly enough, in this first sign of Aries, we have within it the synopsis, the summary, the seed of the entire process as it unfolds. So let's look at the next one, the second impulse, the desire to procreate, which is that of Taurus. Well, let's have a look now, shall we, at Taurus, and in particular the sign of Taurus. You see, I get everything from these signs here, and I might put it in front of me so I can understand what it is I want to talk about. Taurus the bull. Well, the symbol, as you can see, is a circle with a sort of a circular arc on the top of it, isn't there? This is the divine creative process. Now, Aries, the first impulse that we looked at before, it really represents the struggling energy, eager to release itself and express itself and to experience matter. Well, the second impulse, soul impulse, being that in Taurus, is about the activation of creative energy. Here, energy wants to immerse itself in the process of materialization. Now, the energy back in Aries was sort of a vague urge. It wasn't directed, and it was kind of hazy in a way. Well, Taurus is not undirected passion at all. Here, the energy is directed at anything which is about procreation, about making things happen. At this stage, desire is more important than action. The desire is more important than the action. You see, under the second impulse, the second divine soul impulse, desire is more important than action. And what the impulse in Taurus is about the desire to achieve creative union. Now, divinity is causing this impulse to make external, to externalize things which were only previously within the soul. So what's happening is that the urge of the divine is to push out and to make outward things that before were wholly inward, is what I would say. So in Taurus, we see here the importance of the divine, and this circle at the bottom, well, that represents the divine. Now, during the process of creation, the innermost non-material essence, it starts to blossom outward. So Taurus is about the blossoming out of what was held in subjective mind, in formless spirit. And here then we see the material process being continued. Now the second quarter of the circle, which is here, that shows the material impulse. But there's a third quarter, and I'll take it from here, which is showing that there is a desire for release from the material, even though the soul has not yet emerged. It's almost as if it is anticipating what is going to happen. So this is showing also the state of the soul and of the universe before polarization. That is going to come when we get to Gemini. Now, Taurus also refers to one-pointedness. Taurus really, if you like, which has a tremendous amount of energy associated with it, by the way, it tends to hang back and wait until it fixes itself on something that it wants to acquire. Now, the bull's a good symbol of this, I suppose, because what do bulls do most of their time? Well, they lie around they lie around, don't they? But when a cow who is ready to produce a calf comes by, then the bull springs into action and then goes back to its relaxed state. In fact, Taurus individuals can seem to be quite chilled out people, and yet that is until they fix their minds on things like sex, money, achievement, the good things in life. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with those. This is, in Taurus, the stage where energy is flowing in a very directed way. A direction is being established, unlike the chaotic, frenetic state that occurred previously in Aries. Now, this is also about, I think, with Taurus. You might think that Taurus is, that this impulse, or Taurian individuals are hedonistic, or self-seeking, or self-serving, or selfish. They're not. Ivans within Taurus an understanding that this material veil can be pierced, it can be cut through. So there's not just matter, but there is something purer that's there. And in that case, it then wants to serve others, and it wants to serve the divine. This really then is the point at which these arcs, which previously you might imagine as being above this circle, they descend and they touch the circle itself. Taurus is creative potential, procreation, and understanding that there is a direction that needs to be followed. Well, let's have a look next at polarity and Gemini. Well, now we come to the third impulse, otherwise known as the Gemini impulse, the third divine impulse of the soul, as the soul continues its journey of descending, if you like, into matter. Now, this impulse to date, before now, has been asexual. This stage here now marks the division of the sexes. It also marks the manifestation of cosmic intelligence, the fundamental grounding principle from which all other principles are derived from which all other principles come. There is now infused intelligence. There is the creation of thinking, and within the soul, that faculty of thinking leads to I am, and I am different to other things. There is now a passionate attraction between the different aspects of manifestation and existence, of course. And what we see here is that manifestation can really only now start to develop. But having established itself, Gemini now remains uninvolved. It sits back and lets the cosmic process run its due course. Now, in the glyph for Gemini, as you can see here, there are two vertical lines which are bounded by two horizontal lines. Now, these really do refer to they do refer to, in this respect, two human beings. There is also here, depending on which way you're looking at it, there is this downward mark here, which refers to the desire to continue the course into materialization. And the upward one, of course, is that of looking at heaven itself. Now, these are two counterparts here, and yet they are different, aren't they? But what happens in Gemini is, despite the difference that lies between them, between male and female, between one aspect of existence and another aspect of existence, there is nevertheless an attraction, which otherwise their differences might make impossible. Now, the two vertical lines, I think, refer to cosmic intelligence. Now, note that they are bounded by those two horizontal lines, aren't they? And so what we have here is the divinity intentionally restricting its intelligence. If it were not to do that, we would be in there would be no materialization at all. There wouldn't be the capacity for materialization. And I think that this restriction itself refers and is part of the cosmic plane. Now, what there is here also is that we can see that there is the development of intelligence and mind. Now, on the sexual plane, it all starts in the brain, doesn't it? It all starts in the mind. That is what attracts someone to another person. But in the cosmic plane, that is, that plane outside of matter, the development of the mind enables the recognition of time and space. These things, time and space, and manifested articles, are, of course, solely products of the mind. They don't exist as objective facts in the cosmic view of what reality actually is. And so these things are produced by the mind. Now, we had that discussion of the circle in the introduction, which shows that something which seemingly exists is nevertheless, it turns out, a product of the mind, as is a line itself, as is a slope itself. These things are part of our spiritual awareness, our subjective understanding of reality. But in the context of illusion, everything really is possible. In the context of illusion, which is the world of materiality, everything is possible to occur. So this third impulse of Gemini actually could be called the creative illusion, for want of a better term. So it can be seen also as two crosses here. We discussed the cross in the introduction, that Tau cross that I mentioned. Let me just grab a pen. One of those crosses, you'll recall, was the Tau cross, which looked like that, where you had the impulse, the divine impulse, the soul impulse, bounded by and attached to and part of matter. And of course we know that matter cannot exist without that divine impulse. Now these can be seen to occur here and here as well, and so in some respects Gemini individuals could actually be very spiritual. But what we see here is also the complex transformation that is now underway. There is the differentiation of the male and female principles, but also their unification. Pure intelligence now is manifested, and the possibility of high achievement, or for Geminis and for the created universe itself, the possibility for achievement is high. Let's turn next to Cancer. Well, we turn now to the fourth impulse, and that is represented by Cancer. And here is the diagram again. Apologies for my artwork. It is not my strength, as you would have by now gathered, but it's deceptively simple, this glyph that's come about. Now, these glyphs, of course, were undertaken and first devised by people thousands of years ago who had really nothing else to distract them, no television or anything like that, and the intelligentsia of the time, which comprised only a very small number of people who could read and write and were educated, well, they came up with these things, and there's a reason why. This small glyph, this very simple glyph, are two circles joined together by curved lines. And the circle, of course, we discussed in the introduction, so I don't propose to go over it again now. Now, in this impulse, this fourth impulse, the soul looks at the heights of heaven and the perfection contained or associated, provided by it, and it also looks down into the depths of material desire, passion, and hardship, which are often found in the school of material existence. Now, in this impulse here, this fourth impulse, the soul can, on one extreme, produce extremely high levels of intuition, and on the other extreme, it can have a desire for depravity at the extreme, is what I say. Now, these bulges that are here, these signify, this top bulge signifies the desire of the soul for the finer things, the higher qualities, the spiritual, and the bulge down into matter, it signifies the desire for gratification and power and all the things that matter has to offer. Now, of course, it's otherwise known, Cancer, as the crab, isn't it? Well, the crab is, again, a very deceptively simple creature. And what we're talking about here are crabs that one finds around the shoreline. And the crab mainly spends most of its time on land, around rocks and sand and what have you, and some of its time in the shallows of the waters. Now, the crab has 10 feet, and those 10 feet can be divided into two sets of five relating to the 5 sense organs, which can produce things that can only be perceived by you. You subjectively, you in your own way, and nobody else is able to get into your brain and find out how you are perceiving them. And those things include the eye for seeing, the ears for hearing, the nose for smelling, the tongue for tasting. The other organ is that of the skin for feeling. They are the 5, if you like, soul senses, how you individually perceive something. Now the other 5 feet, they relate to the 5, what I'll call motor organs, to do with physical manifestation. And they include the feet for walking, the hands for grasping and doing things, the mouth for speaking, the genitals for pleasure and reproduction. And it's got to be said, the anus for dispelling of the waste products that come within the system. So the crab, if you like, is both half in the realm of soul, half in the realm of matter. Now the behavior of the crab itself, its symbology also shows us something about this 4th impulse. Now the crab mainly spends its time on land, a lot of time on land anyway, close to the water though, but at the first sign of difficulty, or even just because it feels like it, it retreats back into the water. It retreats back. This 4th impulse of the soul tentatively feels out matter, but it returns back to the anima mundi, or the world soul. Now Cancer actually has the unique ability to actually make time and space, dimensions, backwards and forwards, up and down, to actually make them possible on an objective level. Cancer makes those things happen. The other thing that Cancer does in this 4th impulse is that Cancer stamps, it imprints the different forms of manifestation with all of their future possibilities. Now I think in Aries, you remember I spoke of Aries being the embryonic form of everything that was to come. Here, what Cancer is doing, it is stamping, it is imprinting on things in the material world, what their possibilities in the future may be. It also enables the unfolding of different levels of consciousness. And those different levels of consciousness are our waking consciousness, consciousness we have when we are deep asleep, consciousness we have when we are dreaming, and consciousness which you will have found, or you will find if you get into meditation or deep contemplative prayer, you'll find that level of consciousness which is outside of space and time. Actually, I would say that most people have at some point in time felt a moment of transcendence, which is that level of consciousness. Now the eyes of the crab, they can see out into the distance. And so what it does is, this impulse is actually relating to all the buried potential, all the latent potential that exists in anything in matter. So Cancer is, if you like, well, I suppose another way of looking at it is, it's here to say that this circle here, this relates to the, well, what would I call it, potential one view, and this circle here relates to the flowering of that potential. Now, at this level of manifestation, there exists the real, concretized, that is, in objective existence, what we call objective existence. There is now the real, concretized duality between matter on the one hand and spirit on the other, between form and between consciousness, and between potential and its fully blossomed material outcome. Next, we're going to have a look at the extremely interesting fifth impulse to do with Leo. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the fifth impulse of the soul in Leo. Now, the symbol for Leo, as you'll be familiar with, is a circle with an upward arc, and then that falls down and to the right, and then with a little upward turn to it. This stage here is the stage of individualization. The material soul has separated from the anima mundi, from the world soul, from unity. And having separated, it then roams around in matter without any particular direction, the roaming around in the great illusion. And it also then achieves the goal of realizing itself. It realizes itself as an individual aspect of spirit from the great anima mundi. Now, what this is, it is the inner truth, the real you manifesting on the material plane. Now, this is actually the outcome of this divine creative impulse, which has gone down through those other signs that we have seen. And the result of that pilgrimage is the potential now to come into and experience the world, but very much more so in the following sixth impulse in Virgo that we'll get to in just a moment. This is the stage now where the child can develop inside the mother's womb, where the ideas inside the author's mind can be put onto paper and made form, and where the inspiration of the artist can be translated onto physical canvas. Now, the lion, although itself is basically a medium-sized animal, it's not huge, it nevertheless has huge amount of energy contained within it. It has a lot of potential. Now, the lion, in a sense, it happens to be a sort of a golden color, doesn't it? Well, it symbolizes the golden egg, the golden womb from which the soul can spring. Now, male and female energy act together at this stage to produce creation. And the passive in this stage is just as important as the active. In fact, the lion is the vehicle of the golden egg. And it also refers to two very special responsibilities provided to the female in matter. The first is power, and the second is grace in creation. Now, this primordial egg that we can see here, let's just assume, well, it is symbolized by it. This primordial egg that we see here, it actually needs heat and light to hatch, as it were. And it is Leo which provides that heat and light. And it works on you to arouse your creativity. Now, the lion itself is sort of unremarkable, as I say, in the way that it looks just as we are, and yet within it and within you there lies perfection. Now, this symbol that we see here, the circle stands for wholeness. It's the golden womb, the golden egg, and it contains every possibility of creation, every possibility of the way things turn out in matter, all contained within this. Now, the shell of this egg, when activated and when it breaks, it lets free the soul. And the soul then is able to materializes itself. And this is symbolized by this arc, which is occurring here. Now, it then goes into matter in order to obtain, well, experience, to try out the different things that we find in matter: love, sorrow, joy, food, wine, sex, exhilaration. There is here a desire to gain experience, the experience of matter. But this fifth impulse actually contains within it the course of the soul's journey into matter itself. Leo shows the tremendous urge to turn what is in the mind, to turn what is in the mind, what is in your mind, to turn it into form. So, there's a lot of creativity associated with Leo, as you've no doubt seen. But now we turn to the real immersion of the soul into matter, which is found in the sixth impulse of Virgo. Well, now we come to the sixth impulse of the soul, and in this sixth impulse, the soul becomes deeply entrenched, entangled in matter. And this can lead to hardships, it must be said. This sixth impulse can provide difficulties as the soul goes about trying to externalize those things which are hidden within it. Now, the feminine creative principle which arose in Leo that we just saw now is given a direction. You'll recall that the creative impulse was undirected essentially in the fifth impulse of Leo. Now there is a direction to it. In fact, the symbol for Virgo, as you would know, is that of a maiden. Now actually, the maiden is the only human symbol contained in the Zodiac. Now, some people might argue that Gemini is so by way of the twins, but they're normally very abstractly presented, whereas here the maiden is definitely a human person or depiction of a human. Why a maiden? Well, a maiden can be either a girl or a young woman who has not yet become married or had sexual intercourse or taken on the responsibilities of day-to-day life. So there is here no distraction from the direction to immerse in matter itself. That may well be said that during and after that process of materialization, there is some form of impregnation, but there's nothing rock solid about that. That's just what I have intuitively found over the years. Now, what we have here is that this brings an experience of restriction about in this. Well, in this sign, but also in this impulse, as the soul consciousness, if you like, pure consciousness, the soul is restricted by the direction that the sixth impulse, that Virgo, is bringing about for it. It can't just go and do it at once. It has a particular purpose to do, so there's a restriction there. And really, it must also be said that under Virgo, there is a crucifixion, to use that term, of the cosmic human nailed to the cross of matter. Now, you recall in the introduction our discussion of the cross. I don't propose to go into that again, other than to say that the symbol of the cross was used well before Christianity, centuries, maybe 1,000 years or more before Christianity came about and adopted it as a symbol for its particular religion. Now, the symbol for Virgo is, as I say, a maiden. Now, this maiden in Virgo is ruled by Mercury. The other planet that's ruled by Mercury is Gemini. Now, we saw in the third impulse of Gemini that the desire flies around everywhere, that the differentiation, the explosion of differences was completely undirected. Whereas here, Virgo gives Mercury a sense of purpose and a direction. Now, Virgo also shows that the human has been given skin and human faculties, intellect, conversation, ability to talk and to socialize. And what this does is it enables the soul to go through the process of materialization in this plane using those faculties and contained within a body. That's it in a nutshell. Now, this glyph for Virgo, let's look at it quickly, and you will, I hope, again accept my apologies for my artwork, which is probably that of a 2-year-old. Actually, that's probably an insult to 2-year-olds. But what we see here is a glyph which is in 3 parts. Now, there are 1, 2, 3 vertical lines. Now, these vertical lines refer to consciousness, your pure consciousness. And they refer to the 3 states of non-physical consciousness, being dream, deep sleep, and the consciousness that one obtains through contemplative prayer, for example, or through meditation. That is a consciousness which is separate to what you are perceiving in the world itself. I'm sure that pretty well everybody has had, even if they haven't gone through the processes of meditation or what have you, they've had moments of transcendence where they just had the feeling that there was something there. Well, that is that pure consciousness that's there. Now, this snake is sitting on top of these 3 lines that's there. The snake refers to an internal disagreement that's occurring in this stage. This disagreement is between the desire of consciousness to, with this line here, to ascend, to be back in the world, and this nailing of itself into matter. And this can produce anxiety. It can produce psychological complexity. I'm sure you'll agree with me that Virgos are probably the most psychologically complex sign that there is to be found. And what we see here is that we also have within this, symbolized by this snake and the way that it's undulating, there is also to be found within Virgo and within the soul at this time a great peace and a great purity, notwithstanding the sometimes possibility for anxiety, complexity, disagreements, or what have you. What we have here also is that this snake refers to the gathering of the unwoken male energy, and this gives to the soul and particularly to Virgo as well, a great understanding of nature and a great tendency towards goodness when it's blended with the female nature that's here. Now this cross here coming into consciousness, well, very simply, this refers to the soul being attached to and crucified on the cross of matter. I don't want to put it in dramatic terms, but that's what it is. It stands for matter. And it's also the limitation of the higher self, because when in matter, one is restrained by the energy of matter. And the higher self is, in a sense, coming into matter for a particular purpose, usually for learning, for development, and it is restrained from being its unbounded, completely unrestricted normal self. But the line of the snake over consciousness there means that any restrictions, they can be overcome, they can be transcended. And the Virgo traits are creativity, maternity, parenthood, and also there is here also, and you'll see it in this little upward swing down here, there's very often a real, maybe not so very often conscious, but there's an instinct for spiritual development as well. So what happens now is that the involution, that is coming from the pure state into a state that is different and lesser than it, the involution, the descent of the soul into matter is now complete with this sixth impulse of Virgo. And so what we're going to do now is we ask ourselves, well, what happens next? Well, what happens next is that the soul, having experienced matter, then says, well, I think it might be time to go back, and I want to now talk about the evolution, to move from one state to the more complex and pure state. So the next sixth impulses from Libra onwards, they then refer to the regaining of pure spirit once again. So stay tuned next for Libra. Well, we come now to the seventh impulse, that of Libra. Well, Libra is universally associated with the scales, but looking at its symbol, it's a little bit different. The symbol is actually two horizontal lines with a bulge in the top here, and I'll get to that in just a second. At this point in the process of materialization, here the divine spark is totally entrenched in matter. Now, you might recall that in the first impulse, that which referred to Aries, that foretold of the beginning of the first six signs, which was about the involution, the descent into the gradual entanglement in matter. Well, the following six signs, starting with Libra, is about breaking away from that material attachment and returning to pure spirit. Now, Libra stands at the junction between materiality on the one hand and spirituality on the other. Now, here, it's important also to remember that in that first sign of Aries that I mentioned, there, spirit, pure spirit, was the dominant aspect. It predominated. When we're in Libra, it's the reverse. It is matter that predominates. Actually, I'll see if I haven't wiped this off, but you might recall that here in the first sign is Aries, and over in the direct opposite side is Libra, 180 degrees away. Now, in astrological terms, if we were reading it, we'd say that they were in opposition, but it is the complete opposite of that sign of Aries here. Matter predominates, but a process of change is underway in the soul impulse in Libra. And this process of change can, I suppose, be summarized by what I call three currents that are evident. The first one is that simply ignorance is bliss. The soul enjoys matter and is happy to be in matter. And Librans, as we know, do enjoy themselves and the indulgences and different things that life and the world has to offer. The second thing that's coming through, though, is that the pleasures that one normally has found in materiality, they start to lose their appeal slightly. There is, I suppose, what I would call a candle in the heart that is being lit. There is a void in the soul that needs to be filled. And very often, Librans will experience those two concepts, I've found. And the third thing is that there is a real downpour of divine wisdom that's occurring at this stage. Divine wisdom is coming to the aid of the differentiated soul that we saw differentiated in Leo and then nailed to the cross of matter in Virgo. So what's happening is that things are starting to move. However, what we see here is that if I were to use the analogy of the moon, wisdom is starting to wax and materiality is starting to wane. Now, of course, returning to the symbol of the scales, spirituality on one end, there's materiality on the other. Now, they are both extremely powerful forces, and it's very difficult to predict which way an individual person will tend to move. Someone can, and the soul can, quite delight in lingering in the realm of materiality and obtaining the satisfaction that comes from the material life and indulgence, because the impulse for material indulgence now, in the seventh impulse in Libra, it's at its most intense. It's at its most intense at this time. Now, returning again to this symbol just briefly, the bottom line that you can see there, and you'll recall in the introduction how I said a horizontal line was matter. I won't go over that again, but this bottom line refers to complete submersion in matter, that the soul is completely entrenched and entangled in matter. Now, the top horizontal line is broken by this bulge that's here, and what this signifies is that within the soul, a fire has been lit. A fire has started to burn, a huge fire, a fire without heat. And the person can, particularly Librans, can on the outside appear quite relaxed, whereas inside there is a turmoil that's occurring, particularly on the psychic level. Now, even spirituality can be a reaction to the turmoil that's going on psychically within the person here, rather than a direct intention to pursue it. Now, from an occult point of view, because of the particular balance of spirituality, of spirit and matter, in an occult sense, this fine balance between spirit and matter can be used by the practitioner, and it can be distorted, and it can be used to bring about effects which are probably not necessarily ethical, I think. I'm not going to go into that for the obvious reasons. I don't think people need to understand how to do that. But what is important is that this is the turning point. Next, the 8th impulse is that of Scorpio, so let's have a look at it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the 8th impulse of the soul, which is that of Scorpio. Now, Scorpio represents divine potential. You might recall that in Libra, the impulse before it, we saw something of an aspiration for freedom from all the material garments and clothes that were encasing the soul, making it heavy. Matter was making the soul heavy. Well, what we find in Scorpio is that there is now an alignment with the spiritual purpose. Now, the ancients used the symbol of the scorpion to depict this process. And there's also a symbol that goes with it, which we'll look at in just a moment. Now, of course, they looked at the stars, and if you look at the constellation of Scorpio, it looks something like a spinal cord, doesn't it? Well, both the scorpion and the spinal cord, they are capable of producing great, enormous power, hidden power, which, when awoken, has huge force. They both represent divine potential, which isn't actually manifested at the moment. At this stage of the journey, divinity isn't actually manifested, but it's waiting for the right conditions to come about. Now, you will have heard of something called the Kundalini force. Well, that starts in the base of the spine. I'm not going to spend any time on it because it's not related to the soul purpose. But the Kundalini travels up the spinal cord and it results in an altered state of consciousness. Now, what is interesting is that if we turn again and look at the scorpion, the mating process of scorpions is actually quite interesting. What happens is that the female is, if you like, attacked, but is held down by the male scorpion. The male scorpion uses its two hands, I suppose, to hold the hands of the female scorpion down and rub tails together, and then ultimately there is an impregnation that is set in motion. But what happens next is very interesting, is that most of the time the female scorpion will then, following the initiation of the procreation process, will turn around, sting the male scorpion to death, kill it, and then devour it. Now, in the occult world, the hole is very important, like a hole in the ground or a hole in a rock or something like that. Scorpions like holes and were observed, obviously, to stay in holes. Now, in occult terms, the hole represents inside the seed of all of creation. And so what we find in Scorpio is the beginning of a person to look within, to find that divine potential which is within them. What happens is that the 8th impulse really sets in motion and activates the quest towards returning to pure spirit. Now, although materiality is at this time still quite happily enjoyed, people indulge in materiality, what happens is that there's something which isn't just fulfilling enough. There is something more And the Scorpio person will always have that feeling that there is something more. There's something more to this than just everything that we see around us. And looking at the female Scorpion again, it's interesting, isn't it, that although that female Scorpion allowed herself to become impregnated, she then turned around and destroyed the cause of her crucifixion to matter, I suppose. Killing the thing that kept her in matter. Now, the emblem for Scorpio is actually very similar to the emblem for Virgo, isn't it? Here's the big difference. You will have seen it if you've looked at the earlier thing. Now, let me just take this off for now. Essentially, what's happening with Virgo, as you will recall, is that this serpent comes along and there's a tail which comes through, and there is a crucifixion. There's a nailing to the cross of matter itself. Well, it's different to Scorpio, because Scorpio sees matter, it's enjoying it, but what it does is it then has this impulse. And we saw in the introduction what the arrow means. It has the impulse to find the spiritual direction. In fact, the energy that is nailed to matter in Virgo is now struggling to set itself free in Scorpio. Now, this eighth impulse of Scorpio is actually neutral, funnily enough. This eighth impulse actually refers to power which is concealed, not yet activated. Now, if the garments of matter are translucent, if you can get through them, then the energy can move forward on the journey towards spirituality. And if they're not, then that energy can turn back in and can, if it's not released, then there can be selfishness, pride, and sometimes some destructive impulses which can come along. But the release of this secret power that is referred to in this eighth impulse of Scorpio is actually linked to the annihilation, that is the destruction of the self, of this material ego that we've built up in matter. It's a kind of death. And so the eighth house, Scorpio in astrology, is referred to as the house of death, among other things. But what is important to understand here is that though there may well be a process of annihilation, a process of death, there is definitely here a resurrection to be enjoyed. Well, let's look to see what comes next, and that is the famous Sagittarius. Well, now here at Sagittarius is the ninth impulse, and it's represented by a centaur. Now, you will have seen that mythical creature, the lower half of which is typically depicted as a horse, and there is the torso of a man connected to it, and the man is drawing a bow with an arrow in it, ready to fire at something. The lower part of that symbol refers to our animal sexual desire. Nothing wrong with that. And the arrow speaks of aspiring, of shooting, of aiming at something good. Now, the glyph itself, you can see, is quite straightforward. Here it is, an arrow with a cross underneath it. And I'll talk about what that means in just a second. Now, this ninth impulse is actually all about transformation. Here we find that the psyche of the person is weighed down by material desires, by mental impressions of things, of psychological imprints that have occurred throughout the course of life. And together also there is the sum of all of the person's perceptions, their choices, their practices, their interactions with other people, as well as their thoughts and intentions. Now, these are contained within this cross that is here. Now, of course, all these things together, they actually distort your true, pure nature. The real you, that is. This Sagittarius impulse is seeking to detach you from all of the things which are contained within this cross that's here, all of the perceptions, the worldly thoughts, things and matters that are going on there, to detach you from them. Now this, of course, as you would expect, requires a major transformation. But as it turns out, and it is the case, the simple aspiration, the simple desire itself to seek the true self, it actually releases and provides you with the good forces of nature to help you and give you the strength to go along the journey. Now, what there is here also is that there is a downpour of divine energy which cracks open the seed so that the seed can grow, or cracks open the egg in a way. You might remember, for example, when we were discussing the fifth impulse of Leo, there was a circle, which I referred to at that time as a cosmic egg, and it sort of went down like that, didn't it? Well, that impulse there cracked the cosmic egg to allow things to come out. Well, here, which is this, and then to come through and individualize into matter itself. Well, here what's happening is that the seed is being cracked open, the egg is being cracked open to allow spiritual enlightenment to occur, to permit the development of the spirit and to push it forward to its true home. Now, the strings which are contained in the bow, remember that centaur has this bow and arrow? Well, they represent that string, which is very tense. It represents the physical and the psychological tension which you feel at the daybreak, the dawn of spiritual enlightenment. Now, this can be very contradictory for the person. Inwardly, you see, if you have a desire to continue in matter, although and to enjoy all the pleasures that matter has to bring about, but nevertheless you are attracted to the spiritual, there is a conflict that comes within you. But, as I say, the desire to pursue the spiritual, that's all you need. Because what happens very often is that people's lives are changed. There is not necessarily the case of people sitting around and meditating and saying Om and all these things, but there can, in a split second, be a glimpse of the cosmic vision in the person. A split second of a feeling of transcendence. And that's all it takes. And thereafter, the person's life is never the same. Now, the cross and the arrow together, let me get rid of that Leo symbol that's there. This arrow with the cross which is attached to it, the cross also stands for matter itself. And materialization, which can bring about prosperity, it can bring about the pleasures of physical life, and as I say, there's nothing wrong with those. But the cross attached to the arrow, as it is in this case, what that is saying is it is referring to the urge for the soul's liberation from the, what I call the feudalism of matter, to seek liberation of the soul from its entanglement in matter. The problem is, I say it's a problem, but this is the fact that once you have glimpsed, even for a moment, the cosmic vision, that of the ultimate reality, once that has been received, you are hooked. It's stronger than any drug. You crave it and you want more. In this case, the trappings of background life, they become like background noise. There is this intention of the soul to move forward. In a sense, what happens is that a bridge opens up. And Sagittarius is about transforming matter into spirit. It's about transforming human limitations into human perfections. It is about transforming sexual love into a healing art. And under this impulse, there is also bathed in Sagittarius the role of the great protector and the sustainer of everything that is good in the universe. Well, next we turn to the complicated Capricorn. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the 10th impulse, that of contained within Capricorn. Now, Capricorn, as you would know, is normally depicted or symbolized by a goat, a creature which is quite austere in the way it goes about things, and it can live in very harsh environments and survive. Now, in the East, well, in India in particular, the sign can also be represented by the crocodile, interestingly. And there's a third symbol of the sign for me, which is a mystical symbol known to us mystics, and that is that of the unicorn. Now, these three symbols together, I suppose. Well, let's look at the first one and look at the glyphs, I suppose. Now here, these are the two that you would most normally be familiar with. One is a horizontal line with a downward arc, which then goes into a loop and then into another arc. The second one is a V shape, again with a downward arc to the right and a loop and another arc. Now together I think that these show that Capricorns are exceptional in many ways, and really they're quite complicated. They're complicated people. I mean that in a good way. They're complicated people who are not easy to characterize or to say you are definitely this or that. There's a degree of adaptability associated with them, even though they're the first sign of Earth. Now let me talk about the unicorn, I suppose, because this no doubt has aroused your interest. The unicorn is a mythical creature, and you'll understand and you'll recall that it has a horn protruding from its forehead. And what this is about is it's symbolizing the activation of the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is also activated by the kundalini, that sexual energy which rises up the spine, and at the pituitary gland, when activated, can be known as the third eye, and it can provide psychic abilities, psychic awareness here as well. So what's actually happening here is that there is a unification of your personal consciousness with that of the universal life force, that of being itself. And you'll understand what I mean by that. Now, you remember when we looked at Sagittarius in the previous sign there, Sagittarius received a glimpse of the cosmic vision, which then produced a craving, almost like an opiate, a craving, a desire to seek the truth, to seek being itself. Well, what this 10th impulse in Capricorn is doing is that it is providing the bridge which enables human to become superhuman. Now, I don't mean superhuman in the sense of Wonder Woman or Superman, but I mean super as in above, ahead of, on top of, more developed, more advanced. Now, Capricorn, we know, has the goat as its symbol, and as I did mention there's a lot of austerity associated with the goat. And Capricorns are able to be quite austere, if necessary, and still get by. Now, this austerity is necessary to awaken. It's about awakening that pituitary gland to enable the direct perception of spiritual reality. This is an extremely strong impulse, and it is intimately linked with nature's finer forces, and with the result that the soul is stirred. Before it was craving, now it's being stirred into action, and really, as they say in the classics, resistance is futile. Now, what about the crocodile? Well, let me preface my comment by saying this. You will remember when we looked at the 4th impulse, being Cancer, the crab. Now, the crab is a creature that spent a lot of its time on land, although it was also frequently going into the shallows of the water, if you like, retreating to the anima mundi, the world soul, but testing out physical reality. There, the impulse reflected by the crab was about putting together the hardness of a body, the form of the human. Well, the crocodile, in a sense, is the reverse of that. And actually, Capricorn is 180 degrees away from Cancer on the zodiac wheel. They are in opposition to each other. You probably would know that. The crocodile, unlike the crab, actually spends most of its time in water and only periodically ever comes onto the land. So the crocodile is actually the reverse of the process that was found in Cancer. Now, the individualistic soul, the individualized soul, which became apparent when we discussed the 5th impulse in Leo, it now has finished. That individualized soul has finished. It's starting to merge back into the one. Now, what we can see here is that there is a increasing desire to obtain and to come to the universal life force, gradually moving towards it. Now, these two symbols actually approach that concept from two different angles. In the first, this horizontal line, you'll recall from the introduction, relates to matter, the feminine principle here, which looks like it's finished, but then there's a downward arc. And so, although it looks like it's completed, it has to start again. It has to go on another journey to then create a new realm over which in time it must then overcome that. This second one here refers to like a funnel, a divine downpour of divine energy, which enables the person to transcend materiality, to transcend flesh. And what we see here is that when Capricorn has gone through this second task of going through things again, it is successful. But what comes out the other side is something which is actually very interesting. What comes out the other side is an intense impersonal ambition. Now, impersonal ambition, that is not an ambition necessarily for the self, but an ambition to make things better for people around us. Now, the material is symbolized here, the materiality is symbolized here in this smaller circle. And what is happening is that there are four, under this Capricorn impulse, I think special assignments being assigned to Capricorn people. But now, the main point is that individualization is over and the time has come to provide work for the benefit of others, which itself, as you would know, presents very often its own set of difficulties and struggles. Now, let's have a look at the 11th impulse, which is that of Aquarius. Now we turn to the 11th impulse, which is found in Aquarius. Now, Aquarius means water carrier. Aqua, of course, you would know, means water. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Aquarius is an air sign. It's the fixed sign of air, ruled by Saturn. Now, there are a couple of glyphs here which are usually seen in connection with Aquarius. The first one relates to two wavy lines, and in virtually all astrological systems, one also finds the water jug or the water pitcher that's found there. It's always very prominent. Now, as a symbol, water represents the cosmic life force. It is that found within the divine itself. Now, water is important in all spiritual traditions. It usually existed before creation in all the creation stories. In the Hebrew Bible, or the book of Genesis, for example, chapter 1, it said that when God began creating the world, and the Spirit of God hovered over the deep. So there was already water there, and that was also the case in the Babylonian creation stories. And water is featured prominently in religious traditions, such as Noah and his flood, Job being consumed by a big fish, and of course, the water of the sacred river Ganges came from the hair of Lord Shiva. Now, what does Aquarius represent? Well, it actually represents a radical transformation, purifying the soul from all the debris, all the dross, all the carryover that had affected it through the process of materialization and being entangled in matter itself. Now, the incoming impulse, when it's felt by the person and experienced by them, it usually produces a real thorough shake-up, and people's behavior and outlook can change. There is, in a sense, a new consciousness which arises. Now, as a result, in Aquarius, for example, it's not uncommon to see a humanitarian outlook become prominent with Aquarian people, actually maybe even more prominent than that of personal gratification or personal ambition. Now, the psychological outlook, I suppose I'd say, that we saw in Capricorn now becomes changed. It evolves, it changes radically, and it needs an outlet to express itself. Now, when the subjective life force, that is your personal soul, is impacted by the divine in this impulse, then selfish ideas are generally put to the side. But here, at this stage, there is still a separate identity. You wouldn't think there would be, would you? But there's still a separate identity in the soul. But it does merge into universal life, is what I would say. And the process itself is not easy, it has to be said, this Aquarian impulse. I mean, if we look at this jug here, for example, the jug actually stands for the material casing around the soul. But this jug needs to release the water, that spiritual life, that soul life that is contained within you. And release this life force in order to experience bliss. Now, the individual energy contained by the person, because there's still a separate identity at this stage, it needs to merge into universal energy. So this mingling, I would say, of energy, water, life force, this is what comes about under this 11th Aquarian impulse. Now, the jug also is individual consciousness. And what happens, well, what needs to happen is that the jug needs to be broken in order for there to be liberation. So the Aquarian impulse, this 11th impulse, affects and activates both the jug itself, that individual consciousness, that material casing, and it also activates the spiritual, the soul within the person. Now, what then happens is, of course, is that the person can, in this situation, and you can find it with people, are they going to pursue, are they going to break the jug, or are they going to continue to explore the pleasures of individual consciousness and the perceptions and sensations of life itself, or are they going to concentrate and focus on the true home? It's hard to say, and it really depends on what the situation of the person is at the particular time. And this can often make Aquarians or people affected by this impulse difficult to understand, because there is the activation of both the jug and the water at the same time, and the person can go either way. It's nothing that can be predicted. Now, the double wavy lines that we see here, well, very simply, this represents movement in water. The soul is moving, and it also speaks to the changing moods that can affect a person when they are impacted by this impulse. Now, the significance of water and the dual impact on both this material casing and on the true person inside, that can bring about periods of uncertainty, difficulty, and indecision. And there can also be a feeling of restriction by the person, because whatever else one might say about this casing here is, it certainly does restrict the true self that's found within. Next, we're going to look finally at the 12th impulse, which is that of Pisces. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to look at the 12th and final impulse in this journey of the soul, and it is contained within the sign of Pisces. Do you know, Pisces is actually a very favorable sign. It's very auspicious, and it brings with it a lot of happiness, particularly in the later portions of life itself. Why is that the case? Why is there such an awareness and very often just a joyfulness about Pisces? It's because the material encasement, which had been wrapping up the soul during the material journey, it is now broken, and a universal consciousness has arisen when not my will but thy will be done. When that takes hold of the person, it gradually realigns the person so that all material tendencies are washed away, either because, firstly, the person has simply had enough, they're full of it, there's no more that they want to experience with respect to the thing, or secondly, because the person comes to an understanding of how insignificant, really, a lot of material things are, if not all material things are. Now remember, we did discuss at the beginning of the video in the introduction that this life itself is an illusion after all. Now the soul at this point, though remembering the trials and the tribulations that occurred all throughout the journey, from that moment in Aries where the ember first left the sacred fire, until the end here, where the drop merges into the sea. Now, this impulse is actually best illustrated by fish. Now, the sign for Pisces, you would understand, is this. I'm not going to go into the esoteric meanings of this, but I want to focus on my very abstract depiction of two fish with their heads at each other's tails here. This impulse is best symbolized by the two fish, I think. Fish have always featured in spiritual traditions. I mean, they're prominent, of course, in the stories of Jesus. Vishnu, the preserver, took the form of a fish at the beginning of creation. Fish featured prominently in Babylonian creation stories. And of course, we have in the Hebrew Bible the book of Job. It's only a quick story, actually. It's worth reading. Who's swallowed by a great fish. A whale, in this case, people say, but I think it refers to it as being a big fish in the actual text itself. And the reason is because it's talking about the moment when the soul comes to rest and it is finally at peace. Now, Pisces, the fish. The fish, of course, and remember, water is divine consciousness. It is the soul. The fish is completely immersed in water, isn't it? Now, this is unlike those other impulses that we saw, the fourth impulse, Cancer, the crab that would spend most of its time on land, but then go into the shallow water. Or in our discussion of Capricorn, where we referred to the crocodile that actually spent most of its time in the water, but also spent time on land. Here, the fish is completely immersed in water. Now, you know that the 12th sign represents completion, the end of a cycle, but it is also the seed, and it's also about regeneration. The Pisces impulse that we have here, this 12th impulse, it can wash away any materiality, and the person can find themselves in connection with universal consciousness. What is also important about this final 12th impulse are these things. First of all, the two fish, as you'll see here, they are at each other's tails, aren't they? They, if you like, become unified. So positive and negative no longer exist. There is unification. They fuse, positive and negative fuses. Polarization that we saw in the Gemini impulse, that now ends, it stops. And in fact, the complete impulse to manifest, or to come into manifestation, it also stops. Now, those people who perceive this cosmic impulse, and one doesn't have to be a Pisces to get it. I mean, we all have from time to time, I'm sure you have had a glimpse, a moment where you felt some sort of transcendence, where it was remarkable to you and you remember it to this date. But those that perceive this particular cosmic and consciousness impulse, they find that they very often feel different to other people as a result. As I suppose you would, wouldn't you? But anyway, that completes the 12 signs of the Zodiac and the particular impulse of each one. You can jump around, of course. Naturally, it's good to look at it from the beginning, but I hope you've enjoyed this thing on Pisces, and I wish you all the best. Well, I hope you found that as interesting to watch as I've found it to present. It's a fascinating look at the esoteric nature of astrology that you don't often see. In fact, you probably haven't seen anything like this before. Look, I do other things from time to time. You can subscribe to my channel for monthly tarot readings, but I do drop in various things about astrology from time to time as well. And I would very much like to see you again in the future. And until then, may you and your dear ones have happiness and love rain down upon you all. Bye for now.